at the end of the day, the take home is, right, that we need to be consistent, and we need to be consistent when it comes to management on farm, whether it be, again, the feed, making sure the feed's consistent day to day, month to month, and then also consistent to what those diets are supposed to be.
Welcome to Rumination Podcast, the podcast that discusses and shares practical ideas to improve ruminant nutrition, production, and management in order to make your life easier. Hi, I'm your host, Chris Gwyn, and today I'm talking with Dr. Trevor DeVries from the University of Guelph. Trevor grew up in British Columbia, Canada, and always had a lifelong interest in dairy cows. His interest in animal science continued as an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia, where he had the opportunity to participate in dairy research. That led to an interest in nutritional management, animal welfare, and behavior, which he studied during his graduate program at UBC. Trevor then completed a one-year postdoctoral position with the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Lethbridge Research Centre in Lethbridge, Alberta. And in 2007, he began his academic position at the University of Guelph's Kemptville campus, where he worked for 8 years before coming to the University of Guelph's main campus in 2015. Dr. DeVries has received many industry awards, highlighting his high level of engagement in applied published research. In addition to this research responsibilities, Trevor also contributes to teaching at the university, including instructing undergraduate and graduate courses in the areas of dairy cattle management, behavior, and welfare, as well as mentoring graduate and undergraduate students, and in coaching the University of Guelph's Dairy Challenge team. And I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate Trevor and the Dairy Challenge program at the University of Guelph. This past April, the 2025 team placed first in their division. So well done. Congratulations to the team of Gillian Forstall, Tim Hugendorn, Lauren Hunard, and Emmeline Tay-Bokel. Congratulations, students. That's awesome. Now, on to today's discussion about pre-calving management, nutrition, and cow-level stressors that impact and predict future lactation success. Trevor, welcome to Rumination.
Thanks for the invite, Chris.
No, it's a pleasure, as always. Dr. DeVries, your lab has been extensively and intensively looking at cow management and nutrition factors and their associations and correlations with early lactation outcomes. Or if you give us an overview of this most recent study design.
Yeah, so this is a large study that we recently undertook with a large cohort of dairy farms in southwestern Ontario. We enrolled 40 dairy farms as part of this study, both robotic milking herds as well as conventionally milking herds, parlor milking herds, with a focus primarily on the cows in those herds in the close-up period as well as their fresh period. So not specifically looking at milking system effects, but as you mentioned, looking at the management of those cows during the dry period, their nutritional management during that time period, and looking at not only how it impacted the cows during that time period, but also those cows as they transitioned after calving, and looked at the fresh cow success of the cows on those farms and correlating that back to differences in management, differences in environmental conditions, and as you mentioned, particularly things like heat stress. We did this study over the summertime period from May till October to be able to look at how varying amounts of heat stress incurred over that time period affected these cows in a humid continental climate like we have in Southwest Ontario, where, again, we experience fairly substantial periods of elevated THI during the summertime. It can be episodic, and so we are very interested in looking at whether or not some of the kind of heat stress responses we see in more traditional hotter climates are similarly seen in our local climate here as well. And then also kind of compounding on that, the effects of other stressors that cows might experienced during that time period as well. So not just the heat stress, but other housing and management related stressors that could potentially impact those cows during that close up and fresh period.
Awesome. And so that's kind of the overall design. And we look forward to digging down deeper in the next few minutes in some of those things like heat stress and other stressors. I know from some of that initial research was presented and I believe published since then. And one of the factors that came out is that your team demonstrated a pretty large variation and differences between formulated diet and the diet that was fed at the farm level. And I was wondering if you could dig down a little deeper into that and also share some of the other key findings and information from this study.
Yeah, and that one of the kind of factors, so to speak, that we were interested in from a stress standpoint was dietary and looking at differences in diets. And then, as you mentioned, one of the key things that we were actually really interested in is how closely those diets matched what was formulated for those farms, as well as how much variation we saw within farm over time in terms of the diets that were delivered to the cows. And one of the kind of bases of that work was an older study that we had done 10 years ago already, looking at similar factors with lactating cows. And in that research, we not only demonstrated that kind of the further diets became between what was actually delivered to the bunk versus what was on paper, we saw not only a lot of variation there, but also a lot of day-to-day variation. And that variation at the end of the day was associated with differences in production on those herds, not only differences in dry matter intake, but also production and production efficiency, where the herds that were more variable in terms of their diets, both from the formulation and particularly from day-to-day standpoint, those herds had lesser production and lesser feed efficiency. Now, we did something similar in terms of this study looking at close-up diets particularly. And again, close-up diets can be challenging in some respects. Again, when we're trying to feed diets to a cow that we know might be, again, facing different stressors, her intake might be starting to be depressed a little bit. We're feeding a diet that's typically high in forage. Recently, a lot of the farms, and including those on our trial, would have been feeding high straw, dry cow diets, which again can work very well. But if things like straw processing is not great, and again, older research from our group would suggest that when that's not done well, right, the risk of sorting goes up and more variable intake goes up. And so we were really just interested in kind of taking another angle on that variability and look at, okay, well, how much variation do those diets have from what was actually formulated on those farms? And so we collected information about the diets that were formulated from the nutritionists on those farms and then compared that to the samples that we took over that 6-month time period that we had. And we found a variety of very interesting, probably the most and clearest one was a clear association between variability in nutrient content of those diets and the fresh cow outcomes on those farms, particularly related to the metabolism of those cows and some of the metabolic markers that we had of fresh cow health. And one of the markers that we used was a liver health index, which is an index that's been created in more from a research perspective based on a variety of blood parameters to look at basically how successful those animals are metabolizing energy and their overall liver health and early lactation. And what we found, to make a long story short, so to speak, is that those herds that were less variable, so that were basically closer to their target in terms of what they were supposed to be feeding, those herds had a better liver health index and better markers of transition cow health. Now, the one caveat I always say here is that, right, we try to manage as much as we could from a measurement standpoint and control for different variables in our analysis. But But the fact of the matter is there could be other variables that we're not accounting for. And so could this be a direct cause of the more variability leading to poorer outcomes? Potentially, but it could just be a marker of the fact that some of these farms that are more variable, they might not be more variable only in their diets, but it could be everything else from a management standpoint becomes more variable on those farms. And we know that from other research that right more variation in management, whether that's milking management, feeding management, health management in general, right, can lead to greater negative outcomes. And so whether or not this measure that we had is just a proxy for greater variation overall on those farms in terms of their management strategies, it could be. At the end of the day, the take home is, right, that we need to be consistent, and we need to be consistent when it comes to management on farm, whether it be, again, the feed, making sure the feed's consistent day to day, month to month, and then also consistent to what those diets are supposed to be. And that's really the take home from that initial analysis that we did.
So then let's, if I may, because I wanted to ask about how that impacts cow and herd and what you advise, but I think you just did that, right? Be consistent and
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing for dairy producers is just really, and their advisors too, right? In terms of just making sure that when we have protocols in place, when we have systems in place, that those are being done according to the way they're supposed to be done, and do that consistently. And again, if that's being done and the outcomes aren't what we expect, then we go back and we start to evaluate what those systems are and those protocols are, right? But if we're following those protocols and systems the way they're supposed to be done, we've at least eliminated one very large potential source of, right, challenge, so to speak, and that may cause variability in the outcomes that we see on farms.
yeah, absolutely. In your introduction, you also talked about in the study your lab looked at heat stress impacts on the cow and its relation to markers of stress associated with changes in physiology and metabolism. I'm wondering if you could share a bit more details with the audience and what you can conclude from the findings in the study.
Yeah, and that's was one of our goals in this too, is to, as I mentioned, look at markers of stress overall, and we knew that one of the primary kind of factors that we were hoping to key in on was that heat stress, and so that was in itself measured through doing kind of cow level observation, continuous observation over time. We had records of temperature and humidity, so we could calculate THI within the close-up pens and fresh cow pens on these farms. And so in that in itself, we could look at kind of how much heat load those cows were incurring. But then we wanted to be able to link that to the cows themselves and what they were experiencing. And one of the measures, which was quite interesting, was looking at the eye temperature of the cows as a kind of a novel way of looking at how much heat load those cows have. And right, again, body parts.
I got it. Did you say eye temperature?
Eye temperature,
Okay,
yes.
cool.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah. And so again, we know that your body parts do change in terms of temperature, right? They're going to flux a little bit around what we would consider normal body temperature, but there are certain parts of the body that, right, are going to raise quicker and faster and maybe be a little bit more sensitive to changes in that animal's kind of physiological state, and particularly in relationship to experience of heat load. And so eye temperature is one of those, and again, it's been used in other circumstances. And what our data at the end of the day would suggest is that we do see kind of that change, so to speak, as those animals incur higher environmental temperatures and humidity and higher THI. We see a greater amount of maximum eye temperature on cows, which is really kind of neat. And then we also then were able to then correlate that to another marker of stress in those cows, and that's the amount of fecal cortisol metabolites that cows have. And so, again, when we think of stress, we think of the stress hormone, which is cortisol. And there's a variety of ways of measuring cortisol. We can draw it from blood, but that's inherently kind of difficult, right? Especially from a practical standpoint. It does manifest itself in different bodily fluids, for example, saliva. Um, it can be found in hair, even as more of a longer term implicator of stress. And then feces is another. And so, again, there's a certain amount of metabolites from cortisol that might be found in the GI tract and end up in the feces of the animal. And so that was another measure that we took there. And very interesting, again, that we saw an association between the basically the exposure to heat stress in those animals and their level of fecal cortisol metabolites. And so we're then able to use those kind of, or that proof, so to speak, that these animals were stressed, right? And as a result of the heat stress and then some of the other stressors we looked at. And then we also wanted to be able to see how that linked to some of the other physiological changes that we see in cows at transition. And it's not an easy kind of picture to put together all the time, because in cows that face challenges, say at transition, we often see kind of a cascade of different kind of physiological effects. And uh, a lot of those are normal. For example, where you see inflammation in cows, or a cow around calving, we see a certain amount of inflammation. But what research has shown by a variety of different groups over the last number of years is that, yes, some inflammation is good and normal, but excessive inflammation, right? High levels of systemic inflammation is probably not a great thing. And again, that inflammation can come from a whole bunch of different sources. Could come from latent infections, could come from different traumas, different stress, potentially even. And so one of the things that we were interested to see is, did these markers of stress that we saw in these close-up cows also then associate with the markers of inflammation, and then other maybe downstream effects. And that's exactly what some of our research demonstrated, is that these cows that had higher fecal cortisol metabolites not only had that as a kind of a marker of stress, but those cows were also more likely to have elevations in haptoglobin levels, which is a physiological marker of inflammation in cows. And then also, those cows also had elevated non-esterified fatty acid, or NEFA levels, which is a marker of energy mobilization. And so, again, lots of discussion around this still in the scientific realm, in the industry, of what comes first. But in these cows that are facing challenges in early lactation, particularly ones that succumb to disease and poor production outcomes, we not only see increased inflammation, we see increased negative energy balance. Some of that might come out of that. If those cows are highly inflamed, they might have reduced intake. That might lead to more negative energy balance. But the other part of the picture that we've kind of squeezed in here as well is that we're seeing these markers of stress on these animals too. And so some of that might be leading into that, and some of that might be an outcome of that as well, right? And so even disentangling that can be very difficult. But what we've demonstrated, and others have similarly before as well, is that when you see these cows with challenges, they tend to have kind of that, I would almost say, like a trifecta of different things, physiological impacts. So high inflammation, higher levels of negative energy balance, and then also higher markers of stress in those animals.
And I think part of the study was to try and look at these associations of the different stressors at different farms. And I imagine a lot of data still to go through and to present yet.
Yeah, and we're still working through a bunch of these things. Like I mentioned, we've looked at the heat stress side of things, and we've got some really interesting results still coming on that front. We've also looked at some housing and management stressors as well. And so, um, one of the things that I've been particularly interested in over the last number of years is how grouping and movement of cows influences their stress, particularly at a time period where we tend to change groupings of cows. We have to move cows. I'll often describe it as kind of necessary kind of evils, right? Where these are things that have to be done. We know there's negative outcomes. The question is, like, to what extent, right? And so um, in these herds too, we demonstrated that, yeah, keeping, say, first lactation animals separate from mature cows prepartum was very important from a metabolic health standpoint. And so in those herds that group their cows by parity separately prior to calving, so trying to minimize stress, particularly on those first lactation animals, we saw, again, less inflammation, less evidence of negative energy balance, and positive, actually, production, or so greater production in those animals in the first few weeks of their lactation on those herds. And so, again, very positive kind of outcome. Same thing when it came to looking at how often dairy farmers were moving cows and regrouping their cows. And so, again, herds that were, say, regrouping their close up pens more often versus less often, those herds were seeing poor kind of fresh cow outcomes versus the herds where they're moving cows in to their close-up pens every 2 weeks or so and letting those groups basically stabilize and not kind of reintroducing animals and stressors in and around that time period. And again, like I said, we saw less inflammation, better production outcomes in early lactation in those herds. And then similarly, actually, less movement post calving as well. And it kind of makes sense. So, right. So those herds that were moving their cows less in the first 2 weeks of lactation, right? So basically, if they go into a pen, stay there for at least 2 weeks and not get moved during that time period, we saw improvements in markers, again, of liver health and energy balance in those herds that were kind of keeping more stable groups post calving as well, rather than having a lot of movement of cows during that kind of high stress time period.
Hey, speaking of energy balance, I think when I reviewed some of the paper, if I looked at it properly, or recent presentations, back to heat stress and its impact on glucose production. Was that something that you can comment on, findings that you found from your paper?
Yeah, we didn't look necessarily directly at glucose ourselves,
Okay.
but definitely from other work that's been done by other research groups, we know that, again, there's a huge, and when we think of the transition cow, right, we think of there's a huge potential draw, or not even potential draw. There is a huge draw of glucose when that cow calves and she starts lactating. And you even look at blood glucose levels; they drop, right, on a fresh cow versus a dry cow, because, again, the amount of glucose getting taken out of the system, so to speak, for making milk, making lactose, and making milk, there's a huge demand there. And so that drive to produce milk, and then the need for lactose, trickles down to a need for glucose. And one of the challenges, and I think that's what you're referring to, is that when there is things like heat stress going on, we tend to see not only things that may reduce intake in cows, that may lead to less kind of substrate availability for producing energy and glucose, but also inflammation in the gut and things like that can cause leaky gut, where, again, researchers demonstrated that that's an opportunity for actually loss of things like glucose, and basically resulting in a lesser availability of that for that cow that needs that at that time period.
No, okay. Thank you for expanding on that. Appreciate it, Dr. DeVries. The other things that we had talked about, you had expanded a bit more on your findings, your research on stressors and how that relates to management of transition cows. And certainly, is there anything else that you wanted to add in that field of stressors and this study that you're wanted to elucidate or impact on the audience?
Yeah, I guess so. We talked about some of the kind of primary stressors that we were really interested, at least in this research, right, around heat stress, some of the management related things, grouping of cows, movement of cows. One of the things that, again, we haven't got too deep into with this data set, but we know from other work is uh, crowding of cows and competition of cows. That can also lead to stress and more negative outcomes. And again, we know that any time that we overcrowd cows, whether it be at the feed bunk, whether it be at the lying area, whether it's a stall or a pack, or even the water trough, we're going to see a negative impact on the behavior of the cows, which can then result in negative outcomes associated with that. And again, at the feed bunk, if cows just don't have enough space, right, that could potentially decrease intake. We see in kind of mid lactation cows that are stressed by overcrowding, they'll compensate by changing their eating behavior to some degree, and they can, in some cases, still maintain the same level of intake. We don't necessarily see that with transition cows all the time. In most of the studies where we see decreases in intake associated with overcrowding, it's with those transition cows. And so big challenge there. Again, if cows don't have lying space, that's going to cause cows to spend more time on their feet. That's not only harder on their feet, right? Potentially resulting in both infectious and non-infectious foot problems, or increasing the risk of those. But then at the same time, if you're keeping cows on their feet, they're not lying down and ruminating. And again, in some other related research of ours, we've demonstrated that that behavior of rumination while lying down particularly is really probably what drives a lot of rumen health and even dry matter intake of cows. And so those cows really need to optimize their resting time to, at the same time, not only rest, but also optimize their rumination time. And that's going to drive rumen health. That's going to drive intake in those cows. And so, again, the risks associated with not doing those things are that much greater in these transition cows. And then the last kind of resource, so to speak, and I mentioned is before, was water. And that's one we don't think enough about, right? That um, cows drink a lot of water in a very short period of time and only a few bouts per day. And again, if there's anything that's going to limit their ability to get to water when they want to drink, that's going to have a potentially negative impact on their intake, because the dry matter intake of the cow is going to be not only driven by how much water she consumes, but also it's going to, right, be affected by that. And so if she's not consuming enough water, she's going to decrease her dry matter intake. And so another important kind of recommendation that we always say is just don't, right, don't skimp on the amount of available water space to those cows, particularly transition cows. Regardless of the pen size, make sure we have at least 2 watering locations, so that, again, subordinate cows don't have to fight bully cows, right, dominant cows, for that access, and they can at any time of the day access that water and make sure that we're not limiting that very important resource for those cows.
No, thanks for the reminder. The often overlooked nutrient that's so crucial. So thank you for that. Before we wrap up, given what you and your team has been discovering in this research, recommendations that you would like to reinforce for dairy producers, nutritionists, veterinarians, and other advisors?
Yeah, I think we've gone through a number of things. We talked about the variation, right, and controlling variability, being consistent. Consistency is huge, right? And so, again, one of the first things from a management standpoint, make sure we're consistent. And like we mentioned before, if things are consistent and still not working the way we want things to be working, then we start evaluating those protocols and those systems that we have in place. And then beyond that, when we start to think about these cows that are going to be particular transition, that are going to be most susceptible to different stressors, I think for every farmer, for every advisor that's working with them, is to, again, for every farm, look at the situation that's presented at that farm and say, okay, what is the biggest bottleneck when it comes to these different stressors, right? And some farms it might be one thing, some farms it might be multiple things. And so again, there's no one size fits all kind of approach or recommendation. It's more of kind of opening our eyes, thinking about, okay, what are we seeing here? What are the biggest challenges, or what is the biggest challenge or biggest two challenges that these cows are facing? And what can we do to rectify that and make some improvements? And again, often, right, we take away one bottleneck and another might show up, but that's good and that's progress, right? And that's what we want to see. We want to be able to continually make improvements, and sometimes it has to start with by just making one change and then moving on from there.
No, absolutely. Thanks for sharing. Before we wrap up, what's next in your research, Dr. DeVries?
Yeah, this is an area that we continue to work on. This area of management of transition cows. I'm very interested in the other transition, so to speak, that we talk about with cows, and that's from lactation to the dry period.
Yeah.
And again, lots of focus on transition from dry period to calving for good reason. But we also note that there's potential challenges associated with drying off cows that are heavy in lactation yet, not only from an immediate kind of welfare standpoint on those cows, and again, some older good research on the effects on those cows from a pain standpoint, even, right, with udder engorgement. Udder health also very challenging, but then kind of those two factors actually influencing inflammation in those cows, and again, not only immediate inflammation that we see, but also some persistency in that, potentially even right across the entire dry period. And so that's kind of an exciting area that there are others working on, and we're going to be looking at as well, hopefully in the near future.
No, wonderful. Thank you for sharing it. And thank you for being with us today as part of this series of podcasts from Rumination.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
And I want to thank the audience as well for listening to us, and so that you don't miss past and future episodes of the Jefo's Ruminations podcast. You can go to our website, jefo.ca, Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify. You can also find past and future episodes. Thank you very much. This podcast was brought to you by Jefo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. Have a great day.